Elias caught Raymond with his coat pockets full of index cards and did not let go. Elias's fingers closed on a wrist that smelled of pipe tobacco and damp wool. Suspicion tightened his mouth. He did not yet name the motive, only the fact of the act. Raymond, Elias, low enough to keep the corridor from waking. What have you taken? Raymond shoved a clump of folded papers deeper into his coat and tried to step past the ledger stacks. I need them, sir, Raymond whispered, not meeting Elias's eyes. Elias pulled the cards free anyway and let them fall fanwise on the desk, the thin leaves trembling under the lamplight. The cards showed names, addresses, cramped marginal notes. Several had been scraped clean with a blunt instrument. The paper showed ridges where ink had been removed. Elias felt suspicion in his throat and let it steer his hands. He did not call out for the night watch. He did not promise the clerk leniency. He set the cards in a neat pile, smoothing each one with the pad of his thumb, measuring what had been taken and what might still vanish. He had been chief records clerk long enough to read small lies in a man's gait. He had been 47 for a season and counted by habit. Ledgers, loose slips, the brass watch tucked under his waistcoat, the exact angle at which a page turned. The office at night smelled of oil lamp, damp paper, and the faint mineral tang of coal smoke. Those are the facts he kept near, not metaphors. He counted them because counting had been his work and his refuge. Elias sat then, letting the lamplight slide over the exposed names. The immediate problem hung in the room. Cards had been removed, and those cards bore names that might be erased forever. He and Amina had kept small, private copies of some entries before, but never against what might be an organized purge. The question now was not only who stole the cards, but why anyone would strip names from ledgers that had governed taxes and rations for years. Amina arrived with the quiet motion of someone who knew the building by touch. She set a tin cup of tea on the desk and read the scraped entries without a word. Her face tightened in a way Elias recognized as thought set to a plan. She rested a hand on a card and did not pull it away. Amina. Elias, look here, he tapped a smudged name. This one has a marginal instruction. See the penciled note. Amina crouched. That line is new. What does it say? They read the faint, official-looking scrawl together and found wording that suggested removal. An initialed directive and a terse phrase, consolidate record, withdraw. Elias's first emotional change registered in his hands. Suspicion became a firmer doubt that someone higher than Raymond had authorized the erasures. He felt his breath shorten, a physical tightening at his ribs. He set the cards down and reached for the ledger closest to hand. We should copy them. Amina. The sentence was small and immediate. It left no room for debate. Tonight, we cannot copy everything, Elias answered, palm flat over the ledger's worn spine. But we can copy those from this district. They moved without ceremony. The side room held a folding table, a stubby candle, and a chair that had lost one leg and been shortened with a block of wood. Elias brought the ledger and spread it open. Amina arranged the confiscated cards in neat rows, matching them to the ledger columns. Their work that night began a second emotion shift. Doubt sagged into a practical fear, and practical fear congealed into a focused resolve. They copied names by the candle, and their script grew smaller and tighter as the night lengthened. Elias turned each page with extra care, fingers leaving permanent smudges on the margins. He taped an extra slip into the back of the ledger, where he could write a private preface later. He numbered the copies with a small tracer pen Amina had produced from her satchel. 3 hours passed with the scrape of nibs and the steady exhale of two people who had decided to work through risk. Outside the shuttered windows the rain moved in streaks that drummed against glass, a sound they barely noted. The office clock struck twice and then 3 times. The numbers were mechanical and precise and gave them the measure of time to steal. At dawn, the district magistrate Pembroke arrived in his frock coat and with the glare of someone who measured law in ledger columns and sealed envelopes. He stood beneath his own portrait and read the room the way a man reads a public notice. He spoke to the clerks, not to Elias alone. Orders have come from central control. Pembroke, placing both palms flat on the desk. Regional consolidation begins immediately. Local ledgers will be transported to the central registry. All records are to be inventoried and moved within 48 hours, clerks murmured. A guard stood beside the door, his boots bright with recent polish. Elias, steadier than he felt, our personal marginalia being considered part of the official transfer. Pembroke's mouth tightened. All entries are to be preserved according to procedure. There will be no exceptions. Elias, another question then, the one that had lodged in him all night. Will withdrawn files be listed? Will items removed for consolidation be noted on the inventory? Pembroke's reply was thin. You will follow directives. Questions can wait. The magistrate's arrival forced another external event and another change in the room. What had been a suspected petty theft now had the weight of policy. Elias left the magistrate speaking and returned to his table. He and Amina compared their copied slips to the original cards once more. Amina's hand paused on a series of names that all carried the same marginal mark. These all belong to the River District, she said, tapping each with a gloved finger. The market settlement that used to stand by the ferry. Elias looked closer and found the same wiped ink and the same directive. The pattern revealed itself through the work of copying, targeted, deliberate, and official. The realization hit them physically, their movements slowed, hands pausing, breath shallow. The third emotional shift came. Focused resolve moved toward a hard, pressing fear. Elias left the ledger open and hunted the stacks for a sealed volume. He found one with a broken tie and the predecessor's note tucked in the back. He unfolded a margin of brittle paper and read a terse scrawl written in a hurried hand. If ledgers taken, they will be burned tonight. Hide what you must. They read the predecessor's note aloud, and the words fell into the room like a dropped lamp. Burned tonight, Amina repeated, tasting each syllable. Who would burn them? Elias considered the magistrate's order and the note together, mapping how policy could be used to erase people. He felt his jaw tighten and a small tremor in his fingers. He set his watch on the table and listened to the tiny tick as if it were a second voice. He realized the scale of what they faced. Not only theft by clerks but an authorized removal that might end in destruction. There was no time to plan carefully. They needed to choose what to save. They divided tasks with the efficiency of two people who have practiced quiet rebellion in small ways before. Amina would copy marginal notes and personal addresses. Elias would extract one heavy ledger that contained the market settlements column of names. They made fast calculations, weight, size, who could carry what without drawing notice. At dusk, Josiah, the night watchman, paused in the corridor as if counting the steps to decide whether to enter. He had a rope of keys at his belt and a face used to long hours. Josiah met Elias's eye and offered a single sentence. Move quick. I will not alarm dinner. The man did not promise safety. He offered indifference at the right time. Elias nodded. Josiah, he said, if a man asked you to look the other way, would you? Josiah shrugged. Depends on the man, Elias. Depends on the night. They took his shrug as permission. That night the removal began with torches and an official manifest. Men in uniforms filed past the stacks, calling names and titles. The ordered men rang the bell and read lists. Elias and Amina had blended in among the clerks who pretended to help with the inventory. Their hands were steady as they moved between boxes, passing a ledger, taking a ledger, sliding their hidden copies into a satchel with slow, careful motions. The planned rescue turned violent when a guard felt the edge of a heavy book where no book should be, in the stack. Two men seized the corner of a volume and began to drag it toward the yard. Elias pressed his shoulder against the shelf and slid his hand beneath the ledger's spine. Stop that! Elias sharply. A guard barked. What do you think you are doing? Elias met him without grand words. He shoved two ledgers, one weighted and one empty, into the arms of the guards as if offering them the easier load. Take these first, he said. And in the same motion he jerked the heavy ledger free with his other hand. A scuffle followed. A guard hit Elias's shoulder. Amina shoved a lantern toward the men and knocked one guard's elbow. They were three quick motions in a narrow space. Josiah made a clumsy blocking movement in the corridor that bought them seconds. The ledger scraped across wood. Elias felt its leather catch on a nail and tore the seam slightly. They did not shout. They did not fight for long. Elias chose to let another stack go so the ledger with the River District names could escape. The choice was specific and brutal. Which volumes to save, which to sacrifice. In the scuffle a guard caught Amina's sleeve and tore the cloth at the cuff. She hissed and twisted free. Rapid dialogue broke out around them in short lines. Elias! Amina, give it here! A guard ordered,
"Josiah, the door!"
Elias shouted, "I'm holding it!" Josiah answered. The guards pushed. Elias shoved back. A ledger slid free and thudded into the satchel at Amina's feet. She cradled it, folded like a child. When the guards realized the missing volume had been passed into someone's coat, they cursed and called for the magistrate. The men moved with the formality of orders and the impatience of hunger. The office erupted briefly into hands and shouting and the scrape of boots. Then the officials fell into the routine of counting burned and carried volumes as if method could erase moral choice. At dawn the office smelled of smoke and wet ash. Where ledgers had once stood, blackened rings marked the shelves. Pages had been singed and whole volumes were absent. Elias and Amina sat with a single salvaged ledger between them and catalogued what remained. Their copies filled the back pages in small, precise script. Elias wrote a private note on a loose insert and tucked it under the spine. They ran their fingers over names as if testing whether the letters would remain. Amina read a line aloud and hesitated on the place name. The market that months earlier had been a square of stalls selling cloth and fish. The ledger bore not only names, but marginal notes about debts and births and small trades, details that made citizens into people rather than rows on a sheet. We have less than we began with Elias. The sentence was a fact and also a promise to himself. Amina tapped the ledger. We have enough to prove they were here. We have stories attached to a name. That will matter. They counted their losses and marked what they had risked to keep. The ledger would not save everything. They had sacrificed other volumes to avoid detection. They had surrendered records for fields and ports to hide the one book that held the river districts' names. Each choice had weight that they could measure by the emptiness left on the shelves. In the quiet that followed the raid, Elias wrote a short, private preface on soft paper and placed it at the front of the rescued ledger. He did not announce his note. He wrote only 4 lines in a precise hand. The date, the circumstances of the removal, the names of those who had helped, and a single instruction that future readers should look at the marginal notes first. Amina read the preface and nodded. Good, she said, keep the copies. Hide the ledger when you leave. They worked on the plan to conceal the ledger in the office and to hide duplicates among Amina's cloth, bound index cards and Elias's waxed satchel. They agreed on signals and times to meet and on who would carry what if the consolidation extended. Their conversation was all action. Where to stow the book, who would move when, which watchman to bribe or persuade. They moved the ledger to an empty chair by the dying hearth and set it open to a page of names. Elias smoothed the edges and closed the lid of the leather cover without slapping it. He watched the seam where the leather met the pages and thought about how small his victory was against a policy that had teeth. A surprise came when they found an extra folded card tucked between pages that neither had copied. The card contained a short entry, a woman's name, a birth date, and a note reading, left with her sister, safe. The card had been hidden by a previous clerk and not yet noticed. Its presence changed part of their calculation. Someone inside the system had been saving people in small ways for longer than Elias had known. Elias sat back and considered the new evidence. This twist forced a reassessment of the problem. The purge was not uniformly cruel. Some clerks had slipped people into safe ledgers and left instruction. He traced the handwriting with his finger and felt a kinship with that anonymous small kindness. Amina spoke then, quietly. We will keep this ledger moving until there is no more danger. We will not pretend this ends with one night. Elias folded his hands over the cover. He felt fatigue down to his knees and yet felt a stubbornness in his shoulders. The last emotional shift of the chapter came not from a speech but from his choice. He would continue to preserve what names remained, even at personal cost. They distributed the copies among their satchels. Elias took the heavier, better, bound pages, and Amina kept the cloth, bound cards and the tracer pen. Josiah agreed to misreport one inventory sheet to show a volume had been mistakenly catalogued as sent. Raymond, whom they had confronted at the start, returned quietly that evening with an apology and another stack of cards he had kept back. He showed them names they had not yet saved. Raymond, Elias, looking at the young clerk. Why did you take them? Raymond swallowed. They me to carry them away, he said. I thought I could give them to my cousin. Then I saw the marks. I thought. He stopped. Amina, did anyone else tell you to do it? Raymond nodded once. A man from the magistrate's office. He gave me money. Elias and Amina did not answer at once. The revelation suggested a wider complicity and tightened the stakes for the ledger's survival. They wrote Raymond's name and his new information in the margin of the saved ledger. They finished by hiding the rescued ledger on the empty chair under a folded coat, then covering the chair with a rumpled shawl. Elias closed the office door and turned the key in the lock. He placed his brass pocket watch back into his waistcoat and felt the weight of the choice as something physical in his pocket. The chapter ends with a concrete act tied to the night's events. Elias pushed the ledger under the chair and set the shawl over it, then slid the key into his pocket and left the room with Amina carrying the satchel of copies down the corridor toward the river gate. Elias slammed his palm on Porter Abdul's sleeve and tore the folded memorandum from the man's coat. Suspicion lodged in Elias the moment he saw the stamp on the paper. He had learned to trust the shape of official ink. He held the notice up between two fingers, the ragged fold breaking under his thumb. "What is this, Elias?" His voice stayed low. The corridor smelled of wet stone and coal smoke. A guard's boot scraped past the door. The danger was concrete. The memorandum ordered the disposal of named registries and listed neighborhoods by block. Elias's suspicion moved him to action. He did not wait to think. Porter Abdul tried to reach for the paper. Elias put it back, the porter said. His palm hovered near the coat's inner pocket. Elias would not hand it back. "You folded it up like a letter, Abdul. Whose hand signed this?" Elias. He pictured inked signatures and a stamped seal. The concrete stakes made the question simple. Someone was erasing records. Abdul's shoulders dropped. He kept his eyes lowered. It came from the central office. "I was told to carry it before dawn. I thought, you thought to hide it." Elias's finger tapped the memorandum's edge twice, a small rhythm he used when measuring a decision. The tapping is what he always did when he needed to stay precise. It steadied him now. Elias had held ledgers through quieter times. He kept measurements, addresses, births and names in neat columns. The ledger on his desk had a ragged spine and a ribbon stuck between pages. It smelled of ink and old tea. He turned the memorandum over and found a list of street names and family names already familiar to the ledger's margins. He walked Abdul back along the corridor with the memorandum folded between his fingers, the palm watch clinking against his waistcoat when he moved. "Stay where you are until I decide, Elias Abdul." He the words as if closing a drawer. When Elias returned to the main table, the lamplight picked up ghosted smears of ink on his fingertips. He had not slept properly since Raymond had been caught with a pocket full of index cards in the previous week. That evening still lived in the ledger. Raymond pressed against the shelf, coat heavy with stolen names, and Elias had not let go. The memory of pulling those cards from a man's coat had taught Elias that paper could change a life. Amina arrived at the catalogue alcove with a small bundle held against her chest. She set it on the table with careful hands and slid the shawl off her shoulders. "I found these at the tea house," she said. Her sentences were short, precise. Amina's eyes moved over the memorandum Elias held. "Show me, Elias." She untied a cloth strip and unfolded a set of index cards, each card slightly dog-eared, some with smudged ink where a hurried hand had written a name. Amina tapped a card. They were removed from the shelves last night. Some were tucked under a bench, others in a teapot. Someone was clearing them out. Her voice did not rise. She kept her hands steady. They spread the cards on the table beside Elias's open ledger. The names matched neighborhoods listed on the memorandum. Amina pointed to a name on a card, then to an entry in Elias's ledger. "Look, Naza Qureshi. Block 3, Lane 2. Her finger rested where the ledger margin noted an old address. Elias read the line aloud and heard how ordinary the details sounded. Dates, father's occupation, a small note about a daughter apprenticed to a seamstress. Amina folded away the cards and looked straight at Elias. "This isn't paperwork, Elias. They are removing people from the books." Her chin lifted a notch. A quiet defiance entered the room through her posture. They pinned the memorandum beside an open page and started to read the list. The language in the order left little room for interpretation. Names marked for immediate disposal were paired with terse reasons. Relocation sanctioned, registry voided, section to be purged. The words themselves were not poetic, they were instructions. Elias felt the movement of another emotion after suspicion. Alarm. His jaw tightened. His hands moved faster. He read names aloud. He tasted the metallic edge of his fear through the quickness of his breathing. Mrs. Kazi's street, he said. They're re-erasing the lane where her son lived. The ledger entry for that lane had a note Elias had added months ago in a cramped hand. He ran a thumb over the inked line as if it might blur under pressure. Amina's lips pressed together. She reached for the cloth, bound index cards and slipped one into her satchel. Take this to her. Quietly, her voice carried the instruction of someone who had practiced small rebellions. The front counter opened and a woman pushed through the door. Mrs. Kazi's shawl was damp at the edges. She stood with her hand clenched on the register, eyes searching the room, as if hunting a single fact. Elias, please, my son, she said without preamble. Her plea landed in the middle of the office like a dropped coin. Mrs. Kazi, sit. Tell me where he worked. Elias replied, and the ledger page shifted under his sleeve as he flipped it to the right place. He kept the memorandum folded at the top of the table where both could see it. Mrs. Kazi spoke in a single breath. Yusuf worked on the docks. Last month he did the loading at Warehouse 5. Please, there has to be a record. Her voice trembled once. She wiped her hand on the edge of her shawl. Amina leaned forward and read from a card. Yusuf Kazi, docks, age 28, address listed in lane 3. Registered arrival 2 years ago. She arranged the facts with calm hands. Their simple recitation pushed the danger into the open. Elias met Mrs. Kazi's eyes. He hesitated a half-beat and felt another emotion shift, from alarm into a quiet determination. He locked the ledger with a brass clasp and slid it toward her. We will write what we can into a separate page here. Names do not vanish just because someone stamps a notice. He spoke the sentence like an action plan. His fingertip left an ink smear as he opened a fresh page. The office door opened again. Inspector Harrow stepped inside with his coat buttoned and his expression exact. He carried a small black notebook. His inspection felt like a straight line drawn through the center of the room. Good morning, Harrow. He set his notebook on the counter and tapped his pen once. Records must match procedure. What is being kept beyond the guidelines? The question was narrow and tangible. It demanded documents. Elias's posture tightened. He folded the memorandum under his palm and placed it face down on the table. We are maintaining the ledgers as directed. Inspector. Any discrepancy is clerical. He kept his words compact and steady. Harrow opened the memorandum and glanced at the list. His eyes flicked to the ledger and back. He made one note in his book. Some entries will be removed as directed. Do not obstruct. His tone held a thin warning in its cadence. Amina did not move. She met Harrow's gaze and removed her gloves. Inspector Harrow, if you remove names from these pages, where do those people go in government records? How will families track them? Her question was precise and practical. Harrow's hand paused above his notebook. He did not answer the moral question. Instead he said, files follow orders. The office follows files. He closed his notebook slowly. The sentence carried a threat by its simplicity. Harrow left with the same precise step he had used to enter. The deputy who accompanied him lingered at the door, chewing the end of an enquiry into his expression. Once the corridor swallowed their boots, Amina whispered. We are marked now. She tapped the memorandum where the stamped seal glinted under the lamp. Elias and Amina returned to copying pages. They worked with a practiced rhythm. One read aloud, the other wrote in a private folio. Their motions grew urgent without franticness. Amina's hand trembled as she inked letters. Elias paused, tapped his fingertip against the ledger spine, and whispered, We must hide the most vital names. The room answered with the scrape of a chair. While Elias copied a page beneath a low lamp, his pencil caught on a margin note he had not seen before. The handwriting was small and angled, an archival clerk's shorthand layered under official print. The marginalia listed relocation dates and destination codes. A district's name was crossed out and replaced with the word vacant. It was not clerical error. It mapped a scheduled removal of whole streets from the registry. Elias's heart pushed a harder rhythm into his chest. His suspicion sharpened into dread. He tapped the marginal note with his fingertip and felt the paper's slight roughness. Amina, come look at this, he said. She leaned in. Her breath fogged the lamp glass slightly. They have dates here, she said. They are not simply removing files. They are planning relocations, and Irasha's, the way she said the last word was concrete. She named the action and its consequence. They cross-referenced names and times. The marginalia included a set of initials recognized from a file he had seen at Central Dispatch. The initials tied the removals to an office that coordinated forced relocations months earlier. The ledger's neat columns now read as a map of people about to vanish from recorded life. Outside, heavy footsteps moved down the stairwell. Someone came toward the records office with the sound of authority. Elias straightened and felt a new spike of tension. He clipped a loose ribbon into his waistcoat and pushed a chair back slowly. Someone knocked hard at the door. The room held its breath in the sound. A voice called, "Open up, Harrow's deputy here. Instructions to execute." The words landed like an order. Elias's first reaction was to fold the ledger and hide the marginal notes under a sheet. Amina's hand slid over his and rested on the ledger's corner as if to anchor it. The two of them froze in a single motion. To protect paper and to protect each other, Raymond returned late that night with a gait that had lost whatever restraint he once tried to wear. He came back through the airway of the office like a storm. "Give me the ledger," he said. His voice had no softness. Elias stepped between Raymond and the table. "Raymond, you were taken last week. Do not trample the office again, Elias." He spoke with the restraint of a man who catalogued consequences. Raymond pushed past Elias's shoulder. He grabbed for the ledger with one hand and knocked over the kerosene lamp in the jostle. Oil spilled across the table and soaked into a pile of loose cards. A glint of flame caught the edge of a paper. The lamp fell to the floor, and a quick flare licked the air. Papers curled and smoke bit at the back of Elias's throat. Amina's voice rose in a short, sharp sentence. "Put it out!" Harrow's deputy appeared at the doorway with a hand on his belt. He stepped into the room and the pair collided. Raymond, desperate, and the deputy, procedural and ready. The deputy moved to restrain Raymond. Raymond shoved him to the side. There were punches traded, a chair knocked over, a pile of index cards sent airborne. Elias lunged for the burning pages and the edge of the ledger. In the scramble, Elias felt the ledger's spine give under one hand. He tore at the binding to free a few central pages. Flames scorched the corner of the ledger before he could wrench them out. He pressed his hand to the edge of a page, feeling the heat and an instant of pain where a burn marked his skin. The room smelled sharply of oil and char. Amina grabbed a pot and slammed it over the smoldering pile. She beat the suit with a cloth until the paper stopped smoking. "Get the ledger!" she said. Her voice was short and exact. She shoved a burnt, singed page toward Elias. They wrestled the pages free and counted them by lamplight. Some names had gone black at the edges. A section near the ledger's middle had a ragged hole burned through it. Elias folded a salvaged page into his coat. He felt another emotion shift, fury hardening into frantic precision. He spoke quickly. "We must transcribe now. Everything that is legible, we copy into a private book." He the words like a plan and then began to hand pages to Amina. Raymond stood in the doorway, chest heaving. The deputy held his collar. Harrow's voice came from the stairwell. "Hold them. Report the incident." The voice was not nearby, but it carried the authority of consequence. Amina set up a dim workbench in the back room. Two lamps cast tight circles of light. Elias worked with a pen and small, neat strokes. Amina arranged the charred fragments and matched them to the ledger's margins. She paused when names matched a woman who had come in that afternoon. They did not talk much during the transcription. Their actions spoke. Elias murmured a name. Amina wrote it down. Elias checked a date. Amina underlined an occupational note. The rhythm of copying established a kind of quiet resistance. The deputy's footsteps paced outside like a metronome. After an hour, they closed the private folio and wrapped it in waxed cloth. Elias slid the folio into his satchel and latched it tight. He left the ledger open on the bench with a coded mark in the margin. A small dot under the third column. The dot would mean caution to anyone trained to read their marks. It would mean hidden copy exists. He traced the ink dot with his fingertip as if confirming its existence. At dawn, Elias walked Mrs. Kazi to the threshold and pressed a folded sheet into her hand. "This is a copy of the entry for Yusuf. Keep it safe." His voice was low and succinct. He did not explain how they had copied it. He did not explain the marginal code. Mrs. Kazi clutched the paper. Her fingers trembled around the fold and her eyes filled for an instant. How can I find him if they remove him from the ledger?" she asked. Elias met her gaze and pointed to the ledger's margin where the small dot lay. "Watch for the mark. If you see it, you will know where to come. If not, return to me." He the instructions plainly, as if he were handing over a map. Amina stood beside them. She folded her gloves into her satchel and nodded. "We will warn the neighbors quietly. Not everyone can be told, but those who watch the lane will know what to do." She spoke with the steady practicality she always used when arranging papers. "Mrs. Kazi folded the copy into her satchel and left without looking back. The office door closed behind her with a soft thud. Elias felt the day's work settle into his shoulders as a new weight. They had saved names, but the ledger still bore a burnt hole where a family's history had been erased. The marginal notes showed that the erasure was scheduled to widen. Elias tapped his fingertip twice on the ledger's spine and then opened the folio in his satchel. He took out the private page he had given to Mrs. Kazi and set it face down on the bench. Amina leaned in and, with the same quiet insistence she used when filing, drew a line in the ledger margin next to the dot. She wrote a shortened symbol that would warn allies of a purge if more removals came. The symbol looked ordinary unless you knew to look for it. They did not celebrate. They moved in small, careful acts, folding, placing, rubbing out scorch marks. Each action kept the ledger and the private folio from vanishing. The office smelled of damp wool, char and ink. The dawn light pulled up across the floorboards in a hard, thin bar. Elias tucked the private folio into the waxed canvas satchel and latched it beneath his coat. He felt the brass of his pocket watch warm against his chest. He knew the decision to hide the pages had changed the ledger's purpose. It would no longer be only an inventory. It would be a living record kept at the edge of official notice. Before leaving, Elias closed the ledger and set his hand over the spot where the dot rested in the margin. He did not say much. He simply slid the ledger under the counter and let the lock click. As he stepped into the stairwell, a courier ran up toward him, breath short. He handed Elias a small envelope. Inside was a stamped note ordering a review of the records office by the Central Bureau at noon. The courier's hand shook when he spoke Elias's name. Elias folded the envelope and tucked it into his vest. He looked back once at the office door, felt the weight of the folio against his ribs, and then walked into the morning rain with Amina at his side. The rain tapped a steady pattern on their coats as they moved. Mrs. Kazi would have the copy. The ledger would show a dot in its margin. They had made a quiet promise and, by making it, had invited new danger. Elias felt the presence of suspicion at the front of his thoughts again, then a hard, settled resolve beneath it. He kept his hand on his satchel as they crossed the street, and the watch in his pocket ticked on toward the noon inspection. Outside, a shadow detached from the lamplight and followed them for 2 blocks before turning away. Elias did not notice the turn until later. Amina did, and she pressed her hand once to the ledger's cloth where the hidden folio lay. They had bought time with ink and will, but the memorandum showed that the removal plan was ordered from above. They had not finished the chapter of who would survive the lists. They had lit no torch to victory. They had only placed a private page in a woman's hand and scored a small mark in a public book. That night closed with the ledger locked and the memory of charred edges beneath the lamplight. Elias kept the sense that their simple acts of copying had become the only fence between names and erasure. The day ended not with a proclamation, but with the sound of a knock on a neighbor's door and the rustle of a satchel as Mrs. Kazi turned the corner toward the lanes Elias and Amina had marked. Elias heard the sound through the rain and felt the ledger's weight under his coat as a concrete thing of consequence. The chapter closed on that precise movement. Elias sliding a secreted page into Mrs. Kazi's hand at dawn and marking a coded dot in the ledger margin, a small, tangible sign that would warn friends and families if the purge continued. A lantern-bearing sergeant slammed a sealed requisition down atop Elias Mercer's desk and pushed the paper toward him by the corner. Suspicion tightened Elias's shoulders as he reached for the seal. Suspicion had taught him to read the shape of official ink and the way a stamped name sat on a sheet. Elias Mercer, the sergeant said, eyes flat. These ledgers are to be surrendered tonight. The sergeant did not wait for reply. He stepped back, lantern held high, and the sound of boots on stone came from the corridor beyond. Elias looked at the seal, at the stamped list beneath it. He thought of the coat pockets he had found earlier in the month, Raymond leaving the office with a bulge of index cards, and of the way his own palm had slammed on Porter Abdul's sleeve when he had ripped a folded memorandum free. Those actions still sat in his hands like small stains. He kept his voice low. "Sergeant Catry, this office keeps records for the whole district. We require time to prepare a transfer." He did not use the word that rose in his throat. Surrender. Amina Rahman was already at the ledger table. She moved toward the requisition and laid her fingers flat, as if to feel the weight of paper through the seal. "Let me read it." Her voice matched Elias's, low and precise. Her hand trembled only once, where she rested it on the margin. The sergeant's lantern flared and threw hard light across names printed in a small, economical hand. Elias read aloud one line to check it. "Household of Ibrahim Nur, Cavan 42. He felt a small sickening slide in his chest when he saw marginal notes in ink different from the clerk's normal hand. The marginal marks were precise ticks beside certain names. "Those marks indicate removal, Amina. They will come for people listed here." Her fingers tightened on the requisition. Suspicion moved into dread. Elias set the seal between two fingers and flipped the top page to the list inside. "This will expose households." The sergeant shifted his weight. "Orders." He tapped the brass of the lantern. Outside, men waited. Elias heard the rough murmur of authority beyond the thin door and felt the ledger on his lap like a heart that might be ripped out. He recalled Raymond leaving with pockets full of cards. He recalled the folded memorandum he had ripped from Porter's sleeve and the curl of stamp beneath his thumb. The memory was not a general sadness. It was a set of facts that predicted danger. Those facts drove the choice that came next. Elias and Amina exchanged a look. "We will prepare documentation. Elias, we need 30 minutes. We will bring a ledger for inspection." He was buying time with the only thing he could spare. Measured words. Sergeant Catry did not lower his lantern. 30 minutes. He the time like a sealed order and took a step to the door. "Stay put. Do not touch the shelves." He left boots and the sound of men outside. The office felt smaller once the corridor noise cut out. They moved fast, in a practiced, quiet way that betrayed nothing of panic. Amina pulled a cloth-bound stack of indices from her satchel. "We can hand them a ledger assembled from decoys." Elias nodded and folded the requisition into a neat square. He thought of the ledger he kept in his coat, the worn leather book with its brass clasp and permanent ink smudges on his fingertips. The ledger contained names he had copied in nights when officials were asleep and householders still trusted him. That ledger contained marginal notes not meant for the public eye. Raymond arrived at the threshold with his breathing quick and his hands empty. His coat looked as if it had been buttoned in a hurry. "I did not take anything I should not. Raymond." He spoke to Elias with a voice that had a hollow edge. "I put aside a few cards for safekeeping." His eyes darted to Porter Abdul, who stood by the staircase with a folded memorandum clamped hard in his fist. Porter Abdul came forward and slapped the memorandum on the desk. "This links tampering to your people." Porter, looking at Elias. He forced his words out in short, measured bursts. "The stamp matches the time of removal." The name of Raymond with a flat finality. "Raman, step forward." "Where did you put them?" Raman's hands went to his pockets. He hesitated, then pulled out a small, wrapped bundle of index cards. He placed it on the desk and pushed it toward Elias. The bundle was damp with the night's mist. "I hid what I could, Raymond. I tried to save some." His voice hitched when he said the word save. Amina reached for the bundle without asking and spread the cards across the table. They were crude alterations. Someone had scratched out names and rewritten them in a different hand. Certain households were blanked, others had neat ticks at the margins. Amina's breath came quicker as she read, and one of her fingers traced the altered marks. "These protect some names and expose others," she said. "Someone is using registry work to mark victims." Elias's jaw tightened. The word betrayal did not appear in his mouth, but betrayal lived in the inked choices before them. He lifted one altered sheet and put it under the lamplight. The ink that filled in a particular row matched the official's hand on the requisition. That match changed the room. It made an argument from fact. Officials were weaponizing the registry. Amina closed her lips and spoke in short sentences. "We cannot hand this pile over. They'd use it to find families." We will give them a decoy index and keep the originals hidden. She set a stack of pages aside and began marking a false index with her tracer pen. Elias watched the quick, economical movements of her hand. He felt an old habit, the habit that had led him to tear a folded memorandum from Porter's sleeve, settle into the decision in his chest. They worked in silence except for the soft scratch of pen on paper and the occasional creak from the wooden floor. Raymond shifted by the ledger shelves and made himself small among the stacks. Elias motioned him to take 2 prepared folios and to place them where the sergeant would search first. The plan required precise timing. Amina copied names into a false order, and Elias prepared to fold the true pages into his leather ledger. Porter watched them without moving his feet. At one point he said, "You think you can hide what the office needs?" He did not use a long sentence. He did not need to. His hand rested on the memorandum, on the edges of evidence. Elias moved the heavy leather ledger from beneath his coat and opened it to the spine. He turned pages with care, fingers that made small motions of protection. He tucked the most dangerous entries, the altered rows, the names marked with ticks, into an inner fold, and then resealed the book's cover. He set a decoy folio on top, its pages smudged with tea and washed to look used. Sergeant Khatri returned and set a hand on the desk. He glanced briefly at the decoy stack. "Bring the ledger," he said now. His voice was a compressed chord. Elias slid the decoy folios forward. "Here, Elias." He offered the false books and did not look at Porter's face. The sergeant glanced at the stack and barked an order to the men outside. The office door opened and men in coats entered and began to lift folios as if checking their weight. Porter Abdul let out a shallow laugh and stepped forward. He tapped the desk where Elias had closed his leather ledger. "Those marginal notes, Porter, they are telling." He moved his finger along a penciled note that had not been obvious in the lamplight an hour earlier. "Where did you get this handwriting?" His question was meant to be a cornered accusation. Amina answered first. "We copy from field reports," she said. Her voice remained small and steady. She did not let him drag the ledger open. "Much of this is standard procedure." Raymond stood with his hands at his sides. Nothing useful. Porter stepped back, then lunged. His hand reached for the closed leather ledger. He tried to wrench it free. Elias drew himself up and grabbed the binding. "Porter, do not." "Elias." The word stopped because the stairwell was narrow and Porter had the height and the shove of authority behind him. The ledger slid from Elias's grip. Paper pages found where Porter's fingers had managed a corner. Amina yelped as a loose slip drifted to the floor. Sergeant Khatri barked, "Hold him!" He moved to intercept. Porter Abdul's face was raw with something between anger and calculation. "You kept notes outside the register," Porter accused. "You altered records." Elias's hands were on the book again. He could have let go. He could have handed the ledger to them and watched officials flip to pages that would identify households. He felt the old memory of ripping the memorandum from Porter's sleeve, the safe rage that had pushed his palm then. Now, instead of striking, he concentrated on holding the ledger closed. There were 3 rapid lines of dialogue that moved faster than the room. "Give it here, Porter." "No," Elias replied. "Stop him." Sergeant Khatri barked. "Elias, open it." Porter insisted. The exchange lasted only seconds, but those seconds tightened every muscle. Amina pushed herself between Porter and Elias and planted her hand on the ledger's cover with deliberate pressure. Porter grabbed Amina's wrist and twisted. She made a soft guttural sound and did not speak. Raymond lunged and shoved at Porter's elbow. "Raymond, no, Elias." The name came out like a plea and a command. The stairwell became a small battlefield. Men shoved. Papers fluttered. Someone knocked aside a lamp and amber light scattered over pages. Amina managed to slide a hand under the ledger and pass a thin bundle of folded pages into Elias's coat. He felt the small weight of them press against his heart. The shove sent Porter stumbling and a sergeant grabbed Porter's collar to hold him. In the compression of bodies and heat, Elias clung to the ledger and to the secret in his coat. When the commotion eased, officials had taken several folios and were flipping them in the lamplight. They were satisfied with the decoys they found. The decoys contained routine names and no marginal ticks. Porter swore softly when he found certain pages altered, but the proof he hoped for was not there. "We will search the shelves, Sergeant Khatri." And the men began to move through rows, lifting volumes, opening ledgers. Elias counted losses in his head as they rifled through the room. Some pages were taken and removed as evidence. Some sheets with marginal notes vanished into the hands of men wearing official ink on their fingers. He could measure loss where blank spaces appeared on the desk and on the floor. He did not allow himself to name each loss. He named instead what he could save. By the time the men left, the office smelled of wet wool and hot metal. The requisition had been stamped and signed and carted away. The sergeant's boots retreated down the corridor and the door shut like a breath captured. Elias sat with a small salvaged bundle on his knees and counted what remained inside the ledger. A handful of names not present in the seized folios, a single marginal note preserved, a set of household addresses rewritten in a different hand. Raymond stood by the shelves and put his hands to his head. "I wanted to save more," he said, voice raw. "I tried." Amina knelt and set a cup of tea before him. She did not say the word mercy. She handed the cup and let the steam speak. Elias opened the leather ledger and transferred the hidden bundle into a shallow envelope stitched with a small strip of cloth. He wrote one tiny marginal annotation in a minute of cramped script and closed the ledger again. There was a shift in Elias that felt like the tightening of a knot, then the settling of a rope. The earlier suspicion had moved into dread during the confrontation. Now it moved into resolve. He would let particular pages go to protect others. He would count names and hide the most dangerous ones inside his own book. He kept his gestures efficient and small to match the night's practical needs. Amina touched his sleeve and said, "Elias, what will you do with them?" Her question was quiet and asked of the man who kept records for a living. Elias looked at the ledger's worn brass clasp. "I will carry what I must carry," he said. He did not say where or how. He named instead the first task. "We need to mark which houses to warn tonight." They worked through the wet night. Amina penned coded notes on the margins of ordinary receipts. Raymond went out twice to leave false ledgers in the place where the men had searched first. Elias paced the back room and listened for the sound of boots. He tightened his coat collar against the damp and kept his watch. The room grew colder, and the dying fire in his hearth made less light than it had that afternoon. At one point a knock sounded at Elias's outer door. They all froze. Elias moved first and opened the door a crack. It was only a messenger boy with a wrapped parcel for the office. The interruption sent a ripple through them and reminded them that danger could arrive as a small, ordinary thing. Amina breathed and returned to her pen. The external event refocused them on the next practical step. Before dawn, they slipped from the office with a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. The bundle contained the most sensitive names, households that would be exposed if officials paired lists with field parties. Elias shouldered the ledger against his chest and felt the blunt weight of responsibility. Raymond followed with pockets lighter than before. Amina kept her tracer pen close in her fist. They moved through a narrow alley and made for a safe house Elias used for transcribing in the hour after curfew. Rain had begun and it made the cobbles slick. Droplets ran off lamp shades and formed long beads that fell with soft ticks. Elias kept his coat pulled up and his pocket watch close to his hand but not wound. The watch's brass face had a small nick at the rim. He remembered the nick from a day he had been late for a census in a far township. Inside Elias's small room, with a hearth down to embers, he set the salvaged ledger on an empty chair and opened it to a clean margin. He held a stub of pencil and copied names into a hidden note in tiny, precise script. Each letter he formed was an act of protection. An address, a mother's name, a notation of a child's illness. He wrote what he could concretely prove and left out conjecture. The act of transcription steadied him. Raymond slept on the floor with his coat as a blanket. Amina boiled tea and handed Elias a cup. She did not ask him how many were saved. She only sat and arranged papers in a steady hand. "Elias," she said. "You held firm in the stairwell." Her words were not praise. They were a fact. Elias set the teacup down and tapped his fingertips on the ledger's cover, leaving small ink smudges he did not bother to rub away. They tallied what the night had cost them. Several folios taken as evidence would expose at least 2 households. A single marginal note had escaped seizure because Amina had folded it into an envelope and passed it under a loose board earlier. That small rescue felt like a narrow victory. It belonged to the ledger and to the people whose names would not be called from lists in the coming days. Amina looked at Elias and said, "We did what we could." She did not say that this would end danger. She only stated the action they had taken. Raymond sighed and said, "I will go warn K142 in the morning." He used the ledger's code instead of the full name and did not explain why. The decision came from him, not from Elias. Elias made one last notation. He slid the hidden margin into the ledger's inner fold and set the leather book on the empty chair by the hearth. He did not lock it with his watch chain. The brass clasp would be enough for now. He looked at the ledger and then at the dying embers. His hands smelled of ink and damp wool. He felt tired in the way that comes from work done small and precise. The kind of tired that could be counted in the set of fingers he had used to turn pages. Outside, the rain softened. Inside, the room held the tangible traces of the night's choices. A stamped requisition folded on the table, a bundle damp with alley mist, a folded envelope with a single marginal name. Elias sat and wrote a final line in the ledger. It was not an oath or a promise. It read simply, "Save Cave 142, Farah bint Nur." Relocated note attached. He folded the scrap and tucked it behind a ledger page that no one had thought to check. A knock came at the thin door as he closed the book. Elias rose and went to open it. The knock was soft and measured. He slid the bolt and pulled the door just enough to see the face beyond the wood. He saw no uniform, only a passerby with a wrapped loaf of bread and a voice asking for directions. Elias breathed out once and let the lantern's light fall across the threshold. He stepped back to close the door and carried the ledger into the shadowed corner, where he could plan the next small, exact act of preservation. Boots hit the threshold and the door crashed inward before Elias could rise. An inspector shoved a sealed order onto the central desk and barked a name that sounded like a verdict. Elias Mercer opened the ledgers. Suspicion had sat in Elias's chest for weeks, and it tightened into a shaped thing at that first command. He felt the old, practiced caution in his hands as he kept them flat on the table. Amina stood at his left, fingers already at the corner of a stack of index cards, and the room smelled of ink and wet wool. The patrol filled the doorway. Inspector, sergeant, 2 officers, Porter Abdul sweating by the shelves. Elias kept his voice level. "Inspector," he said, "the office is open to inspection. Please state the requisition." He reached for the seal with slow care, reading the name pressed into wax the way he had learned to read a face. The inspector unfolded the document and read aloud, forcing the words into the room. The concrete problem sat exposed in the air. They had come to seize records that, if removed, would silence small lives written into narrow columns. Elias's suspicion moved his hands. He tapped a fingertip against the ledger's edge, a rhythm he used to think. He thought of the night he caught Raymond with his coat pockets full of index cards and did not let go. He remembered Porter's folded memorandum torn from a sleeve and the way a stamped name could change the shape of a room. Those older incidents had taught him to distrust official paper when it arrived wrapped in force. Inspector, these ledgers include personal notations. There are missing pages I must account for." The inspector's gaze hardened. The tension was now a visible exchange. A demand had become a contest over custody. The inspector ordered the ledgers boxed. Porter began hauling volumes toward a crate. Elias moved with the slow insistence of someone who had spent years turning fragile pages. He set marks, straightened corners, and delayed by pointing out simple inventory problems. "Porter, Elias, this one is not in order. See the checksum in the margin." Refiled at first, Porter frowned and paused. The inspector looked at Elias with a measuring stare. Amina's fingers slipped at the ledger's corner, and in a motion so small the room almost missed it. She palmed a thin bundle of index cards and tucked them inside her threadbare satchel. A struggle played against routine. The sergeant checked the seal and the transport order. "We leave at first light," he said. The inspector read aloud clauses and numbers while Elias stalled with precise, factual corrections. Amina arranged papers with quiet insistence. She slid marginalia into order without looking up. "Amina, where did you get that folio?" The inspector suddenly. Elias heard the word folio and felt the room tighten again. He had planned a route for preservation, but the plan depended on seconds and the inspector's attention. Porter overturned a volume at the shelves and a line of names showed where no official entry should have been. The page displayed a marginal column of dates and names that contradicted the requisition's roster. "This says Jaffa 14 June, Porter announced. The inspector leaned in. His face moved from bored formality to focused scrutiny, and Elias watched the shift like a man watching a clock bite through the hour. That discovery pulled the inspector's attention away from the door and toward the contradiction. Elias used that distraction with the slow certainty of a practiced clerk. He shifted his weight, reached beneath the table, and slid a small stitched folio into Amina's satchel. The motion was quick and controlled. His fingers left ink smudges on the satchel's strap. Amina felt the object and pressed her hand over it, meeting Elias's eyes. No words passed. Only the measured exhale Elias always allowed himself after an entry. The inspector demanded Elias open the ledger to recent entries. He pushed the book forward under lamplight. Elias's hands hesitated at the margin notes, the tiny shorthand he used to mark irregularities. He read aloud slow and accurate, entry Sarah B. Rations withheld 3 May. The inspector's brow tightened when Elias pronounced a name that did not appear on the requisition. Explain. The inspector, Elias, explained that Elias could feel eyes on the ledger and on the little folded slips he had spent nights creating. Amina stepped forward. Inspector, she said, quiet and steady, these marginal notes record transfers that did not pass through official channels. They reflect what people actually received. Her voice pulled attention toward the content and away from the satchel at her side. The inspector snapped. That is not your decision, Amina. Step back. Amina did not step back. She rested a hand on the ledger's corner in a small act of ownership, the same gesture she made when she worried. Arguments tighten, Elias. The inspector, produce any duplicate copies you have, any unofficial folios. Now Elias's pulse beat under his ribs. He thought of the nights he had spent duplicating slips, copying lines in a hand small enough to conceal. He thought of Raymond and the stolen cards, of Porter's torn memorandum, and of the requisition last week that had carried a stamped name he did not trust. The room reduced to immediacies. What could be shown, what must be hidden, and how long Amina could keep her hand over a satchel without being searched. Elias spoke, voice low. Inspector, the ledger has missing pages. I discovered the gap while reconciling names. I am arranging the volumes in order so the missing numbers will show clearly in the inventory. He pushed a volume away and pointed to a series of page numbers. That small claim forced Porter back into the task. Porter started counting aloud. The inspector watched Elias like a man watching the slow swing of a scale. Amina's hands were not idle. While they debated, she slid a small tracer pen beneath a fold and wrote a line across the edge of one card so the script matched Elias's hand. She kept her face blank. When Porter called out a discrepancy, Amina, Porter, checked the ledger by the west shelf. The last entry should be at the end of that roll. Her voice was precise. Porter left the inspector's side to verify. The inspector read a paragraph again, frustration sharpening his tone. The hidden column shifted the room's balance. Now the inspector mustered a new demand. Open the ledger to the final entries of the current year. Elias stepped forward with measured compliance and revealed a page of dense, practiced script and marginalia. The inspector pointed an annotation. Who noted this? What is a private transfer supposed to mean? Elias swallowed and said, it is a shorthand to track ad hoc distributions. I kept it for internal reconciliation. The inspector's face lost civility. He demanded names. This was the moment Elias had rehearsed without knowing he had rehearsed it. He steadied his breathing, set a finger to a margin entry, and tore a thin slip of paper from between the pages. He folded it once, then twice, and slid it across the desk. His action was deliberate and small. Amina, he said, low enough for only her to hear. Now. Amina's hand found the satchel strap and slipped her fingers into the doorway by the desk. She drew the stitched folio free and nodded once. Elias pushed the slip toward the inspector and set a match between 2 fingers. He struck the match and held the small flame at the ledger's edge. The corner caught quickly. Smoke rose in a narrow column. The sergeant shouted, "Stop that!" The room erupted into immediate motion. Porter lunged for the book. The inspector barked orders and 2 officers moved to stamp out the fire, while the sergeant ordered Porter to secure the other volumes. The deliberate smallness of Elias's movement became a catalyst. The officer's attention snapped to the smoke and flame. In the scramble, Elias's wrists were seized. Hands gripped his coat. He felt a rough pull and then the command, "Elias Mercer, you are under arrest for tampering with official records." Elias did not fight in the way a man who had planned for this might. He let his shoulders go slack long enough to keep his head from striking the desk. They dragged him toward the doorway. He kept his eyes on Amina for a single, precise second and saw her lift the satchel and move toward the side door. Amina moved through the confusion with the specific economy of someone who had carried fragile things for years. She walked the narrow path she had noted before. Under the records table, past a loose board in the floor, through the storage closet that opened to a service passage. She did not look back. A hand brushed the satchel's strap and her fingers tightened. She kept the folio close to her chest and counted the breaths between footsteps to keep panic from breaking into action. As officers argued over burned pages, Porter confronted the inspector. "Inspector, Porter," loud enough for the room to hear. "This ledger shows entries that contradict the requisition. If we move these volumes now, we'll lose the evidence." The inspector's response was a hard, measured order to proceed with transport. He chose conformity over scrutiny. Porter, unsettled, faltered and then followed orders because the patrol's momentum pulled them. Porter had already overturned one volume and altered the focus. His discovery had not been enough to change the inspector's decision. Outside, dawn paled the cobbled lane. Amina slipped through a back alley where rain still clung to the stones. She kept to shadows, moved with the deliberate quiet she used in the archives, and let the satchel rest against her hip. When she paused at a corner, she took the folio from inside and smoothed its cover with a thumb. No one else had seen the folio's contents. Elias's handwriting showed in tiny exact strokes. She read a single line aloud to herself. Folio duplicate. Selected marginal entries copied in full. The words were ordinary and heavy. Inside the office, the officers crated the ledgers. The inspector barked at Porter to label the boxes. Elias was cuffed at the desk. The sergeant kept a grip on Elias's coat and leaned close enough for Elias to hear breath. "You burned a page, Mercer," the sergeant. Elias met his eyes. He felt the arrest as a completion of a choice, not merely as punishment. "I made sure someone keeps the list." The sergeant's jaw tightened. "Someone else will hold your list now," he said. The desk had become a courtroom table and Elias its only witness. They led Elias down the hall to a small lockroom where they would wait for a cart. He walked with a slow, precise tolerance because he could not afford to flinch and risk further damage to the fragile pages strapped to his chest in other nights. He thought of his watch, brass, worn, and of the ink smudges on his fingertips. He thought of the many names in his books. Simple entries of rent, deaths, births, petty complaints. Each name had been an argument against erasure. Amina turned a corner and checked the folio again. She had to decide what to do next. Elias's choice had been loud. His arrest would make a record the officials could cite. She had the duplicate sewn in tiny, careful stitches, the same hand that made annotations in the margins. She had also carried a separate stack of index cards Raymond had once hidden and which Elias had seized nights earlier. Raymond had not come back after Elias caught him with those cards. Elias had kept the memory of that night like a ledger entry in his head. Amina weighed risk and purpose and chose the path that kept the greater truth alive. Back at the office, the inspector signed transport papers. He read the manifest and crossed items off. He did not notice, or chose not to notice, the faint burn at one ledger's corner. Porter protested quietly. "Inspector, those marginal entries might matter." The inspector cut him off. "We follow the requisition." Pack and move, the decision cemented into policy. Elias had counted on some officers following orders more than truth. Amina passed a laundrywoman at the gate and handed over a few coins for passage. She then threaded through a market lane where early vendors stacked crates. Her throat felt tight. She kept telling herself the small facts she had learned from Elias. Where the office hid its spare key, which shelf kept the older rolls, the habit of the clerk who always left the back pass unlocked for deliveries. These practical details guided her more than courage. Inside the patrol cart, the ledgers were locked and labeled. The inspector's eyes slid over inventory numbers but not the marginalia. Porter watched the cart's frame and then looked at Elias standing cuffed by the door. "Elias, Porter," quieter than he had been in the office. "I did not sign for those marginal entries. I found them," I thought. He could not finish. Elias met his eyes and saw a man caught between duty and a small, stubborn conscience. Elias, Porter, you did what you could. Remember the names if you must say them. When asked, Porter swallowed and nodded, awkward and guilty. When the cart rolled away, the office emptied. A single ledger remained on a chair by the dying fire. Its cover was closed, edges smudged where Elias had left ink, and the final written line showed a short notation in his hand. The room smelled of smoke and ink and wet wool. The ledger sat like a quiet object in a sudden silence. Amina had not left it. She had taken the stitched folio, but the ledger's presence signified the act that had been made publicly visible. Pages removed, some burned, others left. Amina kept moving until she could hide in a lodging house beyond the main road. She opened the satchel and removed the folio again. The duplicates lay folded in neat faces. She set them on a narrow table and, using the fading dawn, checked each name against a list memorized from Elias's voice. She found 3 names she had not expected: Jaffa, Serabi, and Raymond. Jaffa's entry had been in the marginal column Porter found. Sarah's note had been the one Elias had read aloud to the inspector. Raymond's cards, now cross-referenced, revealed a pattern of small transfers and secret loans. Amina realized the folio contained more than private names. It contained the proof of misapplied requisitions and withheld rations. She understood then that Elias had not only documented ordinary lives. He had created a ledger that contradicted an official narrative, an archive that could undo the inspector's neat authority if used. That realization shifted her fear into a sharper resolve. Elias sat in the lockroom and felt the world narrow to the scrape of metal on stone and the occasional footstep. He thought of the ledger left on the chair. He thought of Amina moving with his duplicate in a satchel. He measured trade, offs. His freedom against the preservation of names. He felt a current of consequence in his chest and made peace with it by tracing the outline of his watch with his thumb. At mid-morning, the inspector ordered Elias taken to a holding cell. The procession passed the empty office and the single ledger on the chair. Porter paused at the doorway and lifted the book, then set it back down, fingers lingering over the last written line. That small hesitation was all the ledger needed. The inspector walked on without looking back. Elias noticed the hesitation in a way that felt like a small confirmation. The work of memory had reached someone else, however briefly. Amina had options. She could flee the city and bury the folio in a countryside wall. She could hand copies to sympathetic clerks. She could, as Raymond once attempted, slip cards into pockets and trust small hands. She chose instead to visit one quiet friend, a woman who ran a small apothecary and who had once argued with Elias over the price of ink. The apothecary door opened and closed on the damp street air. Amina placed the folio on the counter and said simply, "Keep this until needed." The friend read the first line and frowned. "Amina," she said, "this will change things." Amina nodded. At midday, a messenger from the inspector arrived at the apothecary asking questions about unusual visitors. The messenger left with nothing but a suspicious glance. The apothecary owner folded the folio into a cloth and pushed it into the back cupboard. She promised to watch for inquiries and to mail a duplicate to a distant contact Elias had once mentioned in a passing note. When Elias was brought before a small magistrate, the charges read like a bureaucratic formula: tampering, obstruction, having unauthorized documents. The magistrate's pen scratched across a sheet. He asked Elias for a statement. Elias spoke with a calm that matched his practice. "I copied records the ledger did not show," he said. "I did it so that, should the books be moved, some account would remain." The magistrate asked why he had set a page alight. Elias looked at the magistrate and said, "To force a pause so someone could leave." The room held the kind of silence that contains the weight of decisions. At the hearing, Porter Abdul appeared and took the stand. How he had found the marginal column, and then how the inspector had insisted on moving the ledgers. His voice broke on a name. "I saw Jaffa listed. Porter, I could not be sure, but it did not match the requisition." The magistrate made a note. The inspector's expression tightened. He spoke in clipped formalism about following orders and protecting records. The hearing concluded with Elias remanded and the ledgers slated for transport to the administrative depot. Amina received a single message through a trusted intermediary. The folio had been moved to safety and small copies had been mailed to a network Elias had used for years. She allowed herself one long exhale and then folded her hands over the satchel. She felt the ache of a choice fulfilled, and the H of an ending. A fortnight later, the records office was quieter. The inspector had ordered an inventory, and the magistrate's docket had begun to include inquiries sparked by Porter's testimony. Some officials whispered about discrepancies, others ignored them. The ledger remained on the chair by the dying fire for a week before a courier came to collect it for cataloguing. The ledger bore the faint burn on its edge and the final line in Elias's hand. No official annotated that line the way Elias had meant. Some clerks only saw the charred corner and moved the book with gloves. Elias received a short sentence for tampering with records, a period of confinement and a formal reprimand. He accepted the penalty with the same methodical composure he had used at the desk. He was allowed, after the sentence, to return to work as a subordinate clerk under supervision. The magistrate's decision carried the small mercy of allowing him to continue his life within the archive's walls, albeit watched and tempered. Amina visited the office once, arranging a small package of tea on the counter and meeting Porter's eyes across the room. Porter nodded. They did not speak at length. The folio's circulation had already begun to take effect. A quiet ally in a neighbor's cupboard, a copy sent to a far-off administrator who had once quarreled with the inspector over allocations. The ripples from Elias's action spread in small, usable ways. When Elias returned to the desk, he found the desk in its old place. The brass watch he had kept in his waistcoat returned, and Amina waiting by the shelves with an empty satchel. She held out a single card, Raymond's last entry. She said, "We preserved it." Elias took the card and read the small scrawl. A memory of catching Raymond rose not as a rhapsody but as a connected, factual record. Raymond had been desperate. He had hidden cards to feed a neighbor's sick child. The knowledge steadied Elias better than any vindication could. They sat together at the desk at dusk. The lamplight fell steady on the worn leather ledger. Elias turned the page with the same careful motion he had used all his life and found, beneath smudged numbers, the tiny annotations he had made in the days before the raid. He saw his own work and Amina's editing marks. He felt no triumph, only the concrete satisfaction of preservation. He tapped his fingertip against the margin and, in a small private gesture, traced a line where the duplicate folio had been hidden. Outside the office, the city's routines continued. Ration queues were ordered, requisitions signed, and men in uniform delivered papers. But in pockets and cupboards beyond official sight, copies of ledgers circulated. Names once in danger of erasure now existed in 3 places. The inspector maintained his authority in public, but the ledger's duplicates had already altered who could say what when questions arose. Elias's role had been simple and total. He had chosen the record over his freedom in a way that matched his long habit: to name, to note, to preserve. He accepted the consequences and returned to precise work. Amina continued to move among pages and people, placing small copies and leaning into practical acts of protection. Porter continued his duties, carrying a new weight of awareness. Raymond did not reappear, but his cards had been rescued. The ledger left on the chair had done the work Elias intended. It marked the line where official ordering met human needs. Dawn came one morning when Elias and Amina found a packet left on the desk. It contained a typed letter acknowledging receipt of certain marginal notes and ordering an internal review. No one celebrated. Elias folded the letter and placed it between 2 ledger boards. The action was quiet, and it connected to the concrete facts that had driven him from the start. Names, dates, transfers written in ink. The Bureau would scrutinize, perhaps suppress, perhaps change procedure. But the duplicate folios existed, and the names lived in more than one hand. Later that week, when the office closed and the last kerosene lamp hissed, Amina stood by the doorway and watched Elias close the ledger. He let a tiny curl of paper rest between his fingers and then set the book on the empty chair by the dying fire. The chair carried the faint scorch from the match he had struck. He did not speak a long line about destiny or fate. He folded his hands and, when Amina touched the edge of the satchel she had emptied, he tapped a fingertip twice on the wood. Amina nodded and left. She walked the lane to the apothecary and found the folder secured in the back, now labeled with a tidy hand and the date of its arrival. She placed a small note beneath the cloth, "For the day names need witnesses." Then she walked away, keeping her stride even and practical. By dawn the office was empty and a single ledger sat closed on an abandoned chair, its pages smudged at the edges and marked at the last written line. Elias's arrest and the copies Amina carried had altered who would stand to tell the truth. A single practical action, the tearing of a slip, the lighting of a match, the slipping of a folio into a satchel, had kept a record alive. Amina pulled her shawl tight, checked that the folio was still secure, and stepped into the grey morning. The satchel pressed against her ribs, and the names inside kept exactly as Elias had written them.